Ta-da! Whoop, I'm hitting buttons. Don't mind me playing with things. Unless you want to see me nice and zoomed in. Probably not. Okay. So, there's 7:30. I got started early, so I was trying to delay, you know. So, we're in Proverbs chapter 5. There we go. Proverbs 4. Proverbs 5. Ooh, here we go. Getting into some heavy stuff and some good stuff. He starts by saying, pay attention. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Lend your ear to my understanding, that you may preserve discretion and your lips may keep knowledge. So he's building up here, right, that there's something important coming. That he can have discretion, that he can know what's going on, you know. But really what we're getting into is he says, for the lips, right, he was building up again. The lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps lay hold of hell. Lest you ponder her path of life, her ways are unstable, you do not know them. Here is a father telling a son to listen up, listen to this, and just like everything else, pay attention to this wisdom and understand this understanding. Preserve discretion, keep knowledge, and it goes on now. Stay away from sexual immorality. Stay away from the immoral woman. Remember that this is all, there's a personification going on here. So it's not just one immoral woman in particular, and it's not women in particular either. I mean, it's the whole idea of sexual morality. And he tells the truth. There's something like honey, smooth like oil. I mean, the idea there is something very attractive to sexual immorality. But in the end, it's death. In the end, it leads to hell. And he's talking about the pain and the suffering, the heartache, and all the things that come along with sexual morality. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's like it's hard to even add to that because it's simple. That there are all these things that would lure us away, but in the end, there's a lot of pain at the end of that road. A temporary satisfaction that leads to a long-lasting pain. It's amazing how some people have never thought about that. If all sexual morality ended, so would all STDs. Sure, there's other ways that they're passed, but not nearly the frequency, percentage-wise, as just through sexual immorality, through fornication. What percentage of abortions would end if unplanned, unwed pregnancies were brought to an end? What portion of single mother homes would not exist if children were never born out of wedlock? It doesn't mean that people won't break up. It doesn't mean divorce is impossible, right? But just how many things could be changed if people just obeyed God when it came to sexual morality? He says, therefore, hear me, my children. Do not depart from the words of my mouth. It says, remove your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house. 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee sexual immorality. 2 Timothy 2:22, flee then youthful lusts. And so this is just an ongoing thing throughout the Bible, from the beginning to the end, trying to say, stay away from this stuff. It's not good. Lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one. You know, sexual immorality has been the end of ministry for many good men and women, I'm sure, but I just think of pastors and others who were being used by God, maybe in high up places, maybe not high up, but still it was given away. They made a choice, and the choice resulted in the forfeiting of their ministry. Lest aliens be filled with your wealth, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner, and you mourn at last when your flesh and your body are consumed. And so it talks not only now, again the downfall, right? I mean, if immorality breaks up the family and divorce, and you watch as your wealth goes away, and then it talks about your flesh and your body being consumed, which again, it's a consequence of sexual immorality. And so he's just warning here. These are things you want to avoid. These are things you want to stay away from. And say, I have hated instruction, and my heart despises correction. I've not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. So this is now you've lost everything, and your body's being destroyed, and now you just live in regret. Why didn't I listen? Why didn't I listen when there were all these warnings that I should avoid these things, stay far from these things, put up walls to protect me from these things? I've counseled bunches of different couples, and it is interesting to see different people's approach and opinions when it comes to protecting their marriage from sexual morality. Many people, not many, but there are people, I talk in there, well, we trust each other and we don't worry about that. And it's like, man, I don't trust myself. I trust my wife more than I trust me. And it's the idea is like, no, you take caution. This is why, I don't know how many of you are watching right now, but I'm sure a handful of the ladies who are going to watch this, you're in group chats with myself and my wife, because that's what we do when we have regular conversations with any women. It's like, I'm just going to include my wife on this conversation. So there's a pattern of not having one-on-one conversations with women alone. Does it seem extreme? Some people think it is. Well, we just think the consequences are too severe, too dire to take chances. And this is what he's saying. Have wisdom. Make smart choices to avoid these problems. And he gives the advice. Drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. So it's talking about from your spouse. The idea is you should quench that thirst, that sexual thirst, from your own well, your own cistern, the spouse whom God gave you. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the street? And that's the idea, is that affection isn't supposed to just go everywhere and be everywhere. It's supposed to be focused on one person. Let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times, and always be enraptured with her love. For why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman, and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? Now, I've actually done kind of lengthy talks on this when we went through the Proverbs on Sunday nights at our church. Probably spent a good long time talking about what Proverbs has to say about adultery and immorality. And even when we were in 1 Corinthians 7, we came back and looked at this. And there's other times we go back and forth because it's what the Bible talks about. Let's see here. I have all these notes. I wrote to the wife, right? Breasts. It says, let her breast satisfy you all times. Yeah, it's for a husband to be satisfied with, not other people. Something for us to consider. It's her and not anyone else's. Let her breast satisfy you. That's a word to husbands, right? You're supposed to let her, your wife's breast, satisfy you, not other women's breasts. It says at all times, and always be enraptured by her love. And there's something there too, that couples should have an intimate love relationship. And it's one of those things, I think, someone who comes and says, well, we've gotten older, and it's just, your love and your relationship will change over time. But the main thing is that there should be an attraction and a relation between two people. And it should be something like, as we read in the last chapter, like the shining sun that shines ever brighter into the perfect day. There should be a passionate love between couples. And that's something that can be brought back too. It's something that can be worked at. And yeah, it's possible for two people to be friends and be civil housemates, but not having that love that God wants you to have. But again, it's a relationship that has to be worked at, just like our relationship with the Lord. Song of Solomon is a beautiful picture of an intimate physical relationship that is a picture of our relationship with the Lord. And so similarly, in both cases, with a spouse and with the Lord, we have to work at our relationship. We have to be sure that other temptations are not stealing our attention from that relationship, whether your spouse or the Lord. It takes effort, it takes determination, it takes purpose, intention. You must choose to have eyes for your spouse only. You must choose to have a heart for the Lord only. And then your actions follow. 4, verse 21. The ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. His own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. Chapter 6 will talk about that entrapment. And so the immorality, sexual immorality, and adultery continues on. He shall die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. And so you're going to find chapter 6 and 7, we're going to see a continuation of this, of adultery and the seduction of the harlot, and how Satan is going to try to tempt you. It's not just something like, that may happen, it's happenstance. Satan knows what people are tempted by, and he's going to put temptation in your way. I want to close with just a word of application from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because I think there's something important for us to realize here. And it's just really, it's nuts and bolts. And it's nuts and bolts that I'm sure lots of churches and pastors aren't going to talk about. I had someone who's been visiting our church recently say, I appreciate you just say it like it is, and you're not afraid to talk about things that other people don't want to talk about. And it's like, I don't know. I've talked with the youth. I've talked with the church. It's like, well, shoot. If we're not going to talk about sex, where are people supposed to learn from? If we're not going to talk about marital relations at the church, it's like, well, I don't know where you're supposed to learn this stuff from. Otherwise, but I want to know what God has to say. I want to know what God's input is, because, well, it was his idea. He came up with it. And marriage is his idea. Confining sex to marriage is his idea. So he has a big role in this subject. So if I want to have anyone's input, I want to have his. Man, okay. So 1 Corinthians 7, it talks about rendering affection to one another, from husband to wife and from wife to husband. Your body is not your own. In verse 5, though, is what I want to look at. It says, do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So something that was common in the early church was fasting, period. Something not so common today, but was very common in the early church, was fasting. But quite often, they would fast from food and sexual relations. It was part of just fasting. Like they were, fasting was a time of solemnness, I just lost the word I wanted to look for. But creating a contrite spirit and kind of really being broken over stuff you're praying about and whatnot. And so that was something that was really common. So this is what Paul's saying, you know, that really as a couple you should be on the same page. We're not withholding ourselves from one another except for those periods of prayer and fasting where there's kind of an understanding. This is, hey, we're doing a time of prayer and fasting. But the emphasis is at the end here. It says, come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And it's fascinating because it's recognizing that Satan is observant. Satan can see what's lacking in a marriage and his demons, and they can specifically target people who are not having their needs met and tempt them very specifically in specific ways. And in closing, as what we talked about when we covered this in Proverbs at the church, we've covered it before, is this concept. Because the subject here, this is where you can go deeper. The subject here is sexual relations in marriage, but needs go deeper than that. 5 Love Languages is a good book, talking about the way people feel loved and their needs. And the emphasis is that if someone's sexual needs aren't being met, and we're talking within somewhat reason here, right? Satan will see that and he will tempt that person in that way. If someone's emotional needs, communication, that connection with your spouse is not being met, Satan will find someone to tempt them in that area. Quite often, Satan will tempt a woman by meeting her emotional needs, and she'll give in sexually. Sometimes a man can be tempted sexually, and it's amazing how he opens up emotionally. The reality is, though, is that from Proverbs through 1 Corinthians and beyond in either direction, we find the warnings of falling into adultery and immorality, whether giving yourself away physically or emotionally. And I do think emotional is different than physical. Those are different lines, but they're still lines where you give your heart away to someone. And even if you haven't done any physical act, you realize you're giving your heart away. Well, Satan is looking for those open doors. He is looking for it. And the best thing we can do as a couple is make sure we are meeting the needs, whatever those needs are, of our spouse. Maybe my closing example. I remember when I taught that proverb 2020. It was 2020 at our church. And I just remember using the example. And I used Kyle, my friend, as an example. And I said, well, you see, I know Kyle very well. I know what makes him tick. I know what irritates him. Might even know some of his insecurities. As someone who knows him intimately, I could probably really get under his skin and poke at him and poke at him and poke at him and really even perhaps say things to him that are vile and just so uncalled for, and get him so angry to the point where he lashes out and strikes me, punches me. The reality is, as a Christian, not in self-defense but in anger, you really never have the right to punch someone. That's not what Jesus would do. You crossed the line by punching someone. Kyle crossed the line by punching me. But we understand why he did it. We can be empathetic. Doesn't mean it was okay. But we know why he did it. We saw what led up to it. It's the same with adultery. And it's the same with anything like that, where it's never okay. Never, ever, ever, period. No matter what excuse you come up with. But at the same time, you can look at all the things that led up to it sometimes, and you're like, you know what? I get it. I mean, I see why the person stumbled. Doesn't mean it's right. So we want to nip things in the bud. We want to go all the way back to where Proverbs says, you know what? Rejoice in the wife of your youth. Rejoice in your husband. Let her breast and her breast alone satisfy you. Men and women with that mentality that I love my spouse, my eyes are only for them, my heart is only for them, my body is only for them, my thoughts are only for them, and being conscious about proactively. Wouldn't it be better as spouses, for those who are married, if rather than feeling like I've got to twist my needs out of my spouse? As Christians, we should be proactively just thinking, what are the needs of my spouse and how can I meet them? And then you get over to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, which I think we just recently mentioned, how in many ways that's what Peter's saying. Wives, be a godly wife. Be submissive to your husband. Go illicit, but the idea is, spouse, be a godly spouse, that your spouse, who is an unbeliever, or maybe they're just having a rough season and patch, can be won without a word. If we want to have our needs met, we should focus on meeting their needs, and that's how we'll see our own needs met. And that goes back to 5 Love Languages. Good book on marriage. We've got a bunch of copies at church if you need one, but very good marriage book. All right. Probably went long. I don't know. God bless you guys. Have a great day. And I will